introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Chris Knight from the United Kingdom, Global Commercial Director, FDI Intelligence. Mr. Knight, please introduce the panelists.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, it's currently pretty interesting times in the world of trade and investment. You know, with Brexit, the rise of protectionism and the US policy. But then on the other hand, we still have new regional trade agreements being agreed in Africa with the TPP. So I've been joined here by a great panel who I'm going to actually I'll introduce their names, but they're going to give 3 minutes a little bit about what they do. So we've got, in order, we've got Eva beside me, followed by Paulo, followed by Philip, then Mary and Alastair. And each of them will now briefly brief you on who they are and what they do.
Good afternoon. My name is Emerson Ovitz. I'm working for the European Commission for Director General for Trade. I'm dealing with GCC countries and also with Eastern Partnership countries, countries which are lying on the eastern border of the EU, with whom we have special partnership. I, of course, look at all those partners from the perspective of trade relations and investment relations. I'm working for the European Commission already over 12 years, and I'm happy to be here in order to share with you some messages from the European Union angle. Thank you.
So, Chris, thank you. I started in the private sector, and then I flirted with politics, and I've been for 16 years leader of the Conservative Party in Portugal, which is an old Conservative Party, not a new Conservative. And I was National Defense Minister, and then Foreign Affairs Minister, and then Deputy Prime Minister in charge of economic policies, investments, and exports. And I'm back to the private sector. So this is what I do. One of the things I do related with this panel is teaching here, geoeconomics and international relations.
Hello, my name is Phil Kowski. I'm a Chief Operating Officer of the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC. ICC was founded just after the First World War in 1919. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary next year. We were founded based on a premise that if the world trades openly together, it would bring peace and prosperity. We had a few details along the 100-year history that got in the way of that, but we are by nature an organization that pulls together the private sector, chambers of commerce, business organizations to encourage and develop free trade. And by vocation, we are staunchly opposed to protectionism of any sort.
That's a good statement.
Thank you. I'm Mary Hebert. I am based in the United States. I'm Senior Vice President for WAVTech, overseeing their North American operations. We are a data, technology, and consulting firm, primarily supporting investment promotion agencies and creating databases and software products that support site selection and company expansions overall. I started my career in finance, working for Morgan Stanley a number of years, trading stocks and commodities, before moving on to the university system, focusing on research around personal income tax policy as well as incentive policies, and then worked for investment promotion agencies, specifically targeting the Silicon Valley market and working with fast growth technology companies in their site selection plans.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this invitation to join the panel. My name is Alastair Long. I'm the UK's Regional Director for Trade and Investment in the Middle East, working for the Department for International Trade. The Department for International Trade is the UK's Trade and Investment Promotion Department, but also now responsible for our trade policy and trade finance. And at this critical juncture for the UK, as it prepares to leave the European Union, it is that department that is also charged with coming up with our new trade arrangements globally. And I, therefore, coordinate all of that work for the Gulf, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Thank you.
So as you can see, we've got the world pretty well covered, and we'll have some good opinions about this. So I guess we got to start with the elephant in the room. Right? What's going on between the US and China? And I guess if we start with Eva, what's your opinion on what's going on, and also how is it going to affect Europe?
Yes, I opened my Twitter this morning, and there were several articles on that subject, and of course this subject is in the center of European Union attention, as the United States and China are our important trade and investment partners. We look at what happened, what United States initiated from the perspective of how we could manage globalization, because we know that we have to face globalization, it exists, and we have to manage it properly. And we consider that there are international trade rules which can be applied in case of overcapacity in certain sectors. And what we observe in case of the United States, that they applied so-called national security clause in order to deal with real sectoral problems. Of course, the European Union countries were also covered by this measure announced on steel and aluminium. Therefore, we reacted immediately, and when the measure was announced in March, we responded at the beginning of April with announcement that we will start investigation on based on the so-called safeguard clause, because what we are afraid of is that this general overcapacity will lead to the deflection of trade, and these countries which export steel and aluminium to the US may want to export on the European Union market, and our industry is already vocal because they are afraid that it may cause serious injury or threat of the serious injury. We are covering by this initiation of investigation 26 steel products. We are not touching yet aluminium. Why 26 steel products? Because actually the European Union, within the international cooperation on steel market, already introduced so-called surveillance of imports into the EU. So we will look during the next 9 months if this imports indeed increases and creates a risk of serious injury for our industry. Of course, we were exempted from the measure by the US after intervention of our Commissioner for Trade, but until 1st of May only. So we will see what will happen next. But even if we are covered by this extension for the next month, we are afraid that countries who will be exempted, they account more or less 60% of steel imports to the US, but the 40% which stays may also create some problems on the EU market. Therefore, this investigation which we started recently, and we will see what will come out after 9 months. We can also introduce so-called temporary measures if the situation requires, but the investigation will show if really definitive measures are necessary, and they will take form of the increased duties or so-called tariff quotas. But this process is ongoing, and it's too early to prejudge what will happen.
Thank you. And actually, Paulo, yesterday when we met, you were saying you do a lot of business in Latin America and in Africa, and there could be opportunities going on there with this. Do you want to fill us in about what the feeling is in the countries that you're working with there?
Look, Chris, about the question of United States and China, I would say the situation of global trade is much better in reality than in perception. And we live in a world of perceptions, sometimes unhappily. Just forget tweets or fake news and go to the facts and evidence of reality of trade in 2017. First full Trump year in presidency. The growth of global trade was back. In 2016, as you know, suddenly the growth of trade was reduced to 1.3, back to 3.6. What is relevant in these figures? The growth of trade is again boosting global trade, like in the last 40 years, with two exceptions, 2008 and 2016. Factor B, in the first full year of a protectionist president, trade deficit of the United States raised 12%. This is not a matter of tweets. This is a matter of results. And the exports of the United States grew 6%. Imagine imports. So, if you see macro evidence, things are better than the perceptions. And there is another factor. It's very interesting that during all these controversial statements on protectionism, you have had in 2017, 2018, very interesting opportunities for new spaces of trade. I mean, first, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement without United States. 11 countries signed in Santiago de Chile 1 month ago, March 8. 14% of global GDP, mainly Pacific states of Latin America and Asian states. So, when you withdraw a nation like United States from an agreement, and I recall that both Trump and Hillary Clinton were in favor of withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific, you create opportunities. Who leaded this opportunity? Japan and Canada. Interesting. Second factor, in my opinion, a very positive hope. 44 countries of Africa signed the declaration to impulse a free trade agreement in Africa 1 month ago, under the leadership of President Kagame. I hope this is the first year of full implementation of the Canada-EU trade agreement, happily saved from populism and demagogues in Europe. And this is also a year where Canada is negotiating with the 4 Mercosur countries from Latin America, and Europe will have, or not, the opportunity of finally finishing the Mercosur-EU agreement. Not bad. Those are the facts. A little bit different from tweets. Okay, so trade growth is back, and that is a very good phenomenon in my opinion. I'm free trader, to be transparent. I think globalization creates a more balanced and fair world, and protectionism normally is a contribution to poverty. But okay, this is just my opinion. But facts on global trade are these ones. Africa can have a huge contribution to global growth and global trade, and we can discuss it. And Latin America is back after a long recession, namely because of Brazil and Argentina. So we will have 2% of average growth this year in Latin America, and I call your attention, Argentina is back to markets, Brazil overcome the recession, and you have already 3 decisive elections in the biggest or more relevant economies in Latin America. I mean Argentina, and then Chile, and then Colombia, and the 3 are coherent with a free trade oriented orientation. So a free trade oriented result. Let's see Mexico and Brazil in October. But if the big 5 economies in Latin America Chile, which is the best GDP per capita in Latin America. And then Mexico, 70% of exports. Nothing similar in the continent. And then Brazil by its dimension. And then Argentina. And then Colombia, which is a market of 50 million people. If those countries and those economies are ruled by free market-oriented leaders, this will boost growth and trade with and in and among Latin America.
Okay. Sounds positive for us all.
It seems in better shape than tweets and fake news.
Well, let's move on to the actual companies then, and with Philip. What do you think this means for businesses, specifically businesses operating globally, whose supply chain might be coming from several different countries? What will they be thinking now?
Well, I think the word of optimism that I will share is that trade is such a powerful force that some temporary protectionist measures will never stop companies trading internationally. And the fact that we're in the beginnings of a transforming digital world anyway means that even SMEs now, which represent the majority of jobs and growth around the world, are trading more and more internationally. So it's a given that companies will carry on trading internationally. Protectionism is like cholesterol. It blocks up the arteries. You know, it stops the blood flowing, and it stops you sort of operating normally. We point the finger today, of course, at the world's two biggest economies, but there's lots of examples in history of them doing that previously. The Obama administration in 2009 imposed tariffs on tires coming from China. It saved 1,200 jobs, but it cost an absolute fortune. It raised prices, and at the end of the line, it's the consumers that pay the price. And there are many examples around the world of the rise in protectionism. One of our members refers to it as the 3 Ps: patriotism, populism, and protectionism. And usually they sort of go together if you see the regimes that are producing that. But from a company's point of view, from our members' point of view, very few of them are actually worried about protectionism, because in a lot of cases they're bypassing this. Of course, if you're a steel maker and you're getting imposed heavy tariffs, that does have a temporary effect, but they never last. There's no case at all in history of protectionist measures either being successful or lasting a long time. They're usually used by populist leaders as a temporary measure to show that they're defending jobs. But jobs won't come through this. Jobs will come through more fluid growth. We are concentrating more of our attentions now onto small business, and small business really don't have time. Small business don't come to meetings like this. They don't have time. They want tools. They want easy ways of getting their goods through customs. The World Trade Organization, after many years, pulled off a wonderful coup in 2013 with the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which was ratified last year. That was the first time in history 165 countries agreed on applying easier, more efficient, and cheaper customs. That makes a difference to business. Being able to get your produce online and it not being hacked or stolen, or protecting your intellectual property, that also is important to business. So what we try to do is provide businesses with those tools, and we don't avoid the question of protectionism, but we kind of push with the arteries that supply the bloodline through to businesses as much as possible.
Okay. So Mary, being the only American on the panel, it'd be good to get your opinion on what's going on, what it means for the companies that you're speaking to, not only with US and China. You might want to touch on NAFTA and the possible breakup of that, and in general TPP, whichever angle you think is most relevant.
Yeah, thanks. It's becoming more and more entertaining to be the only American on panels. So I do not speak for all Americans, but I do think I have a lot in common in terms of my viewpoints with many of the panelists, especially as it relates to SMEs. I mean, having worked with Silicon Valley companies for a number of years, you see them much more global-minded. Initially, expansions were, within the U.S. domestically, and now they want to expand, their business internationally at the same time as they grow domestically. And I think that we need to have policies that support that. One of the things that we do try to stress as, from the U.S. market is that this is not a done deal. Certainly we have hope that there will be something that will be worked out. We do understand that there need to be fair policies. I mean, I worked with a number of solar companies that had, quite an issue with the Chinese market, 6 years ago or so. I think it's interesting to see how the rhetoric increases from each country to start targeting specific industries to really get at the political pain point. So for example, China targeting many of the farmers or people in traditional Trump-supporting areas of the country. But what's being lost is they're also, really focusing quite a bit on some of the more liberal type of industries as well. They're looking at wine in Napa Valley. They're also looking at aerospace, which tends to be more focused in the northwest section of the U.S., which does have quite a liberal voting bloc. I think one of the things that's difficult with this kind of protectionism, made in America, policy and priority is that we're really ignoring the trends on what's happening with exports in America. I mean, still we're exporting more goods than services, but services are the fastest growing segment of exports in the U.S. 80% of the U.S. market is now in services. So, to have, I think, some of the policy leaders that are currently in office, really being concerned about trade deficits, I think they're also ignoring, the first economic class you take in university where you learn about comparative advantage. So certainly, we do need to think about manufacturing and how to support, communities that rely upon manufacturing, but, there is an overall trend that we can't ignore. One of the things that, it's interesting with Hillary Clinton specifically because she was for TPP, then, she was trying to appeal to more liberal wing, and so then she was against TPP, and then she went back for it once again. But she did support quite a bit workforce training around, around job losses due to trade. So I think that that's something that we need to get better at, and other countries need to consider as what they export and where their industries shift is how do you specifically compensate workers for jobs lost due to trade. So I would say that. I mean, the other thing that I can get some concerns about is this kind of made in America rhetoric and all of this talk about trade agreements in general. I mean, TPP, and even things just like the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, I think that certainly there is this strategy where if we have this kind of rhetoric, then maybe it will incentivize countries on a one-off basis to try and immediately negotiate for exemptions, and does that put us in a better position? But I think there's also, real concerns that this is going to affect our reputation as somebody who really can give their word and stick to it. And, on the NAFTA side, I would just say, I do think that there are valid concerns, especially with some of the goods and services between Canada and Mexico, but I do also think that trade agreements need to evolve over time. They can't be written in stone. So having an agreement that was, constructed before really the rise of the internet, yes, you do at some point have to renegotiate that. But I do think that so much of what I've heard in terms of NAFTA is much more political posturing than actual policy leadership about what's best for all of the countries involved. And remembering that these are our neighbors and it's a global economy and we depend on them to perform well for us to perform well.
Thanks. And now for me, moving closer to home, speaking to Alastair from Department of International Trade. I guess for you, Alastair, no conference ever goes by without the B word being brought up, right? So we're going to have to just bring it up to you now. So with Brexit and the divorce from the EU, you know, the UK will be looking at free trade agreements throughout the world. Do you think, which countries will you be prioritizing? And is it going to be enough to compensate for not being in a single market, in your opinion?
Thank you very much, and it's been really interesting listening to the comments so far. And as you rightly point out, we're starting to think in the UK about things we haven't really thought about for about 40 years. That's not to say we weren't very active contributors to the discussion in Brussels on trade policy and on our trading arrangements, but the UK is now having to prepare these for itself, as I say, for the first time in many decades. And as we look at the world, and as we look at the UK economy, the change has been so enormous that as we look to the future, we're thinking particularly about trade policy around services, around digital, around the kinds of arrangements and systems that will allow an agility to move at speed when commerce moves at speed. And it's just picking up on some of the comments made there. I mean, those go to the core of this current argument. It's extraordinary in some ways to think that it's still so focused on aluminium and steel when the knowledge economy of the United States, the SME growth, all of that stuff is really the lifeblood of the future, you know. So for the UK, as we sit there and we think about what do we do first in a year's time as we move into our transitional agreement, which of course allows us to start negotiating trading arrangements elsewhere. It's a very complicated process of sort of prioritizing and thinking where to go first. The one clear conclusion you reach quickly is we can't do it all at once. It is an enormous task, and so there does need to be a prioritization. And in some ways, that might direct you towards countries with whom you think you can quickly conclude a mutually agreeable arrangement. It might direct you somewhere where you think you particularly need a trading arrangement. It might even direct you to places where you think you can get a favorable one, which could be a model for elsewhere. I will only disappoint you and say that we haven't concluded the process yet. We do know that we need to look at all those factors. And there is also a very significant piece of work which is in trying to roll over some of what we already have as a member of the EU. So the EU has a number of agreements, of course, and a number of them that we have shaped and that we're very proud of. And we would like to see those matched for the UK as we leave the European Union. One really, really important point I think I want to make at the outset is there is this, I think, quite unfair perception that the UK is becoming more isolationist with this move. And that is absolutely not the intention of the UK government at all. And as Paulo said to me outside, in no way in keeping with the history of the long history of our nation. I firmly believe we will achieve this, but the government is intent on becoming the leader internationally of free trade from 2020 onwards. Free trade not just for the benefit of the UK, though of course it will benefit the UK economy, but free trade for everyone. That is why it is so important to my Secretary of State that we are able to set our own trade policy, we are able to enter into our own trade agreements, but also we are able to continue offering preferential access to the UK economy for developing nations. We are able to put our trade policy together alongside our development policy, and we try and bring increased wealth to all parts of the world, not just to the UK with this departure. The other really central point is we will be looking globally for trading arrangements everywhere, but we will certainly not be looking at the European Union. We are a part of that continent, and we have mostly profoundly important commercial ties with our European partners. and in no sense is the UK departing Europe, it is departing the European Union.
I think it's perfect time to speak to Eva and get the EU Commission viewpoint on it and get a discussion between the panelists going, I think.
Yes, but before I come to Brexit, I have to refer to the previous subject very shortly, because what EU is worried about, that the United States is stepping back from the international trade system, WTO, etc. So here we are really seeing this disengagement, and it's hard to foresee what will happen in the future. As concerns Brexit, of course, first of all, we have to regret that democracy prevail, and we are losing one important member state, especially a member state which was always at the forefront of liberal trade. So here we can only regret, not mentioning other aspects, and we had to enter into the process of depriving United Kingdom of the membership in the European Union. This process is ongoing, it's gradual. We are now at the stage of finalizing so-called withdrawal agreement, which will be probably ready at the end of the year in order to be later on ratified by both sides, because on the 30th of March next year, Great Britain will be the third country, will not belong anymore to the European Union. But in order to have this demembership, let's say, quite smooth, there will be a transitional period which will last more or less 21 months until the end of 2020. It means that in that time all businesses will be covered by the same rules as they are covered now, but they have to prepare for this departure of the UK from the European Union at the end of 2020. In that time, UK will be able to negotiate agreements with our partners, with whom the EU now has free trade agreements, be it other agreements, but those agreements will not be able to enter into force in this transitional period. So this is as concerns third partners of the UK and EU. As concerns relations between the EU and UK, and there is an agreement of the political leaders at EU level that we could start scoping the future agreement, which will be rather a free trade agreement, which will not give the right to the UK to benefit from four freedoms of the internal market of the EU. So this is what we are facing now. It's really sad period, I must say, because for 40 years UK was our member, and now we have to go through this divorce process, which is not very pleasant.
Oh, Chris, look, Portuguese and British were the oldest allies in Europe. So it's supposed to be the oldest diplomatic alliance. And, you know, I'm not British. I will not comment the reasons and fundamentals of Brexit. I will never understand why they call a referendum if they have the best parliament in the world. But okay, it's done. And democracy is not just good when the result is a pleasure. What are the British corporations, what are they going to do? What they always did very well. Trade, buy and sell. Sell and buy. More sell than buy, but buy and sell. They are natural traders. So they will rebuild trade agreements with more freedom. Some more freedom and less market, because jeopardizing a 500 million internal market is really in the limit of the sense of the common sense. There is one thing we should be able to distinguish. I know it's politically correct to talk about Trump and Brexit, but Trump and Brexit are not the same thing. Brexit is not protectionist. Pay attention. One thing is the nationalism of UK, which are islands and are nationalists, but they were never protectionists. Other thing is the American protectionism, which is present in the pendulum of America for decades and decades. Don't forget, you are entrepreneurs, much of you. Try to go and win in the public markets in the United States. Try to overcome the Buy American Act. Not easy. It didn't start with Trump. What started with Trump were the tweets, the tone and the style. But the substantial of a pendulum between protectionism and globalism, isolationism or expansionism was always an American pendulum. Finally, I want to say two things, so just to, one, I think the real test to the American foreign trade policy will be NAFTA. And we'll know in some weeks. In some weeks, we will know if NAFTA finally will be renegotiated. It has been renegotiated 11 times. It will be the 12th. Or if NAFTA falls. If NAFTA falls, I think we should be very worried with the substance of the American foreign trade policy. But if NAFTA, as it seems, is close to a renegotiated result, I wouldn't be very worried and I wouldn't pay so much attention to tweets, okay? Facts are facts. Yes, what worries the President of the United States, not only this one, is the fact that Mexico has a very strong case for competitiveness and investment. Yes, it's true. Mexico has 70% of exports in GDP. From those 70%, 80% go to the United States. But don't forget one thing. From those 80% that goes to the United States, half, at least, import pieces from United States. So this is obviously the withdrawal from NAFTA will have a setback on American economy and will have a setback against American corporations. The other point is on EU, I should be very attentive to the critical point. I'm very heterodox on this, and the critical point to European Union is the fact that on digital economy, EU is out of the Champions League. Digital economy is for the moment a competition between USA and China. Just pay attention to the top 10 techno companies of the world. 6 are American, 4 are Chinese. None is European. That should be a red alert for European institutions, because this is the future. And by the way, just to finish with a politically incorrect statement, globalization and digitalization are parallel lives, but are not the same thing. Many of the accusations and criticism against the globalization have a wrong address. Because what is destroying some employments we know as we know is not globalization, is the substitution of the human factor by technology or innovation. And you can make a pause in the globalization, but you won't stop innovation. So prepare with flexibility to a much more and more digital economy. And that digital economy needs more than ever brains. Brains are everywhere and don't depend on race, sex, political opinions, or religions. So a too excessive restrictive migration policy in the United States will damage the techno companies of the United States who are currently leader, because you need to contract young people, very smart, very good engineers, very good mathematicians, very good people of technologies of information, and you can't have laws against the freedom of contracting. And in my opinion, you can't have laws also against the freedom of firing if justified. And so I would call it the attention. Europe is discussing, has a very self-centered discussion, but pay attention. The world is moving, and in the digital, we are not in good shape.
Thank you. So we're nearly out of time, but there is one question I want to get some quick answers to. With all of this said, what's the future for the World Trade Organization? If we start with Philip, because we chatted about this previously, yeah. I'd love to get your input on that.
Well, just a couple of points just to reconnect with the investment side of what we're doing. Investment needs confidence. Companies need to be in a context where there's confidence for investors to come. And if you've got a political situation which is creating uncertainty and creating instability, that's not good for investment. That's the first thing. Now, we believe you need rules. And because if you don't have rules, then it's a free-for-all for everybody. And what the WTO has done is provided a level playing field, has provided a mechanism where countries can get together and discuss together. It's a platform for information as well. And it's also, probably more importantly, the home to a massive dispute resolution body, which basically, if two countries fall out, which they're doing now, what the WTO has done in the past is intervene to try and find an amicable solution. So that is a very important role. And you can say what you like and criticize the WTO, but what would happen if we didn't have it is that you would have a situation where countries would just really strong-arm, and the stronger economies would have a bigger and better impact over the others. So we work closely with the WTO. We try and work with them to establish some rules. At the moment, we're working with them to try and develop some rules on e-commerce. And the recent events of the last couple of weeks have shown that we need some rules. We need some rules on data protection, on protection of intellectual property, and we need some rules on what we can, on counterfeit goods and everything that internet needs to do to be able to put in place responsible business practices.
Anyone else have any comments on your thoughts? Yeah, Alastair?
Just to say, I mean, I think we still believe the WTO is at the very heart of trade and the rules-based system, which has to be there and has to be supported. And the more that regulation can be appropriate and light touch, fine, but it has to be there and it has to be agreed. And it is one stage where the UK wants to be an absolute champion of free trade into the near future. It is also, however, a body that hasn't yet extended its reach into digital, into services, into the knowledge economies of the future. And we would welcome it doing so, we'd welcome supporting it doing so, but some of that debate will take place elsewhere as well. And that's healthy and that's fine. But the idea that the WTO wouldn't be at the heart is certainly not something the UK would understand.
Yeah, and I would just go back to the digitalization conversation in terms of, what that's looking like. As a multinational enterprise, it becomes quite challenging understanding privacy rules and data protection from country to country. And I think the more that we can determine how to standardize that in some way, we will be able to increase innovation among SMEs. I mean, if major corporations are having issues determining what the rules and regulations are around these issues, imagine what it's like for a startup trying to navigate this when they just really don't have the time or opportunity to do so. So I think that that's going to be, a really big issue. That, along with the idea of monopolies and how much control do these, mega technology companies have. I mean, don't forget that all of these SMEs that come up are constantly, they want an exit strategy. And we aren't seeing exit strategies so much in the form of going out onto the stock market. They're much more favoring large investment from private equity firms or acquisitions from these major technology companies. And I think also, we need to get together and determine what is our appetite for allowing these companies to have so much control. And when they have this much control, how much are we even then able to regulate some of the privacy issues that we're all beginning to have some serious concerns about?
Thank you. Just before we close up, I've been told we've time to take a few questions from the audience. I'm pretty sure with all our colleagues up here, you'll have something you need to find out. So, any questions out there? Yep. Yep, see one. Is there a microphone? I think there's one on its way.
Thank you. I'm Alex Ruhunda from Uganda. The comment on African countries coming together, I do not know the implications, especially when we have seen that we've been taken advantage of by dealing in our smallness when it comes to negotiations with Europe through the EPAs or even World Trade Organization. The African countries have suffered because we come small. But now, how do you now see the future, given the fact that now the African leaders have decided to come together? Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to take that question?
Do you want to go?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. Again, 40 or more countries coming together to trade freely and openly must be a good thing. The fact that it's in Africa, where there's always been lots of obstacles, either at national level, political level, is also a good thing. And by coming together, it not only opens up, there's less than 5% of trade within African countries internally. It's staggering that the vast majority of trade with Africa is external, which is why a lot of the key commercial trading centers in Africa are around the seaports. And I think that bringing those countries together will stimulate intra-African trade, but also, as the gentleman has said, it brings together a collective body that will give better bargaining power and perhaps help a lot of countries within that group to evolve and to benefit from some of the growth stimuli.
Just to say, look, I have much hope in Africa. I work professionally frequently in African countries and not only Lusophone countries. And if you ask yourself, what is the continent that can add global contribution more reinforced to the next decades on global growth? If Asia is already where it is, we need Africa. This is one point. The second is about other continents looking for Africa. There are at least 25 good stories in Africa, even if the newspapers just talk about the 20 bad or medium stories in Africa. And what are the countries who are acting very well if you just consult evidence, facts? Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Uganda, Senegal, Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda. That means the Africa that's working, it's the Africa non-dependent or excessively dependent on oil and gas. It's very interesting. The countries without an economy based totally or largely in natural resources are doing very well and are stable countries and building cases of competitiveness. I just let you two signs of hope. In 2025, Africa will have 15 cities with 15 million or plus inhabitants. Can you imagine the opportunities of partnership that reality, 15 plus the 15 millions of inhabitants in 2025 is tomorrow. And the other thing is, in 2020, 700 million Africans will have a smartphone. And that is a very good sign about development and also a sign about future migrations. But that's a question for Europe, not for Africa.
Thank you. Yes, another question here.
Sure. If we have time for this, it's a bit of a broad question, but it'd be great if one or two of the panelists could elaborate on the implications of some of these protectionist trends for investment. So what is the likely impact going to be of potentially reduced trade or increased trade barriers on foreign direct investment, say in the US or in China, in the EU, and certainly in the UK?
I mean, I would speak quickly to that in terms of the U.S. and, being with a firm that works largely with quite a number of U.S. IPAs and their interest in attracting foreign investment. It does become difficult because there are several things. There are the trade policies, and part of that is also just what creates a perception of unfriendliness toward international enterprises, as well as, the idea that investment also often follows trade, right? So if you're investing and serving so many customers in the U.S. market, and now that becomes difficult, you're less likely to do an expansion to, get into proximity of those customers. And then the other thing that we haven't, spoken about that does also concern me, is related to immigration rhetoric as well. Countries like Germany and even, the U.S. in terms of non-immigrant populations and the current birth rate, it's going to become very difficult to compete without, immigration reform that's comprehensive and fair. So also if you're investing in the U.S. or in any other market, you do not want to feel like you're promised some kind of immigration policy, able to attract the right kind of talent, and then at some point that's no longer true. Additionally, there have been lots of reports about the return on investment in terms of taking in immigrants and training them and having them contribute to the economy, especially when you have a low birth rate. So I think, in addition to protectionist trade policies, I do see a lot of that rhetoric is consistent with harsher immigration policy because it all kind of goes back to this misguided nationalism.
John, a word?
Just briefly for the UK, I mean, you mentioned us at the end there, and please do pick it up with me afterwards. I'd be interested in your view. But, the first thing is to agree with Paulo. I don't think the UK is going in a protectionist direction. That's not the intention. But secondly, we saw the highest level of investment into the UK ever last year. And the fundamentals of the UK that would make it attractive for an investor remain. We speak English, we're in a good time zone. We've got a fantastic legal system, low tax, low regulation. There are so many advantages to the UK that will remain, that we hope we will remain a very attractive investment destination.
And finally, Eva, you had a couple of words?
Yeah, I would like to add that the European Union is a great promoter of the liberal investment policy and gives certain good practices how it can be dealt with. We are in the negotiations of stand-alone investment agreement with China. We also cover investments in our bilateral free trade agreements in order to influence mostly the regulatory sphere of our partners and through that way promote flow of investment. The recent idea which is discussed within the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law relates to the International Investment Court, and the EU is very engaged in that process because we consider that we should improve the existing state investor dispute settlement which exists. We already reformed a bit the system and put the special clauses in our free trade agreements which relate to the investment court system, but we are also very much supporting the regulation at the international level of these disputes, because we, through this, we not only encourage investment, but we also take care about retaining investment in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the lights coming on was a tip that we were nearly out of time. So we just took those extra questions, but I'm sure the panel will be around for another 10, 15 minutes if anyone wants to meet them offline. Just leaves for me to say thank you to everyone who is on the panel. I think it was a good engagement, so thank you and give them a round of applause.